Three. I'm Richard McCall, and this is the LatinNews Podcast, episode 2, recording here with Andrew Thompson, an expert in Chile, freelance journalist, joining us today. Of course, I hope you enjoyed episode 1. That was with John Farmer a fortnight ago. We were discussing Peru's continued constitutional and, well, I would say overall crisis. So if you've not yet listened to that, please tune in. But without further ado, let me say, Andrew Thompson, thank you very much for coming on the LatinNews Podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I think it is a great time because we're watching things unravel for Boric, new president, well, reasonably new president there in Chile, and you are the man to explain to us what is going on. And, after the pendulum politics in 2019, can you put us into context about this a little, please?
Yes, I mean, it strikes me that a lot has happened in Chile over, let's say, the last 3 to 4 years. And I was searching for some way of, creating a framework of understanding, if you like. And I came up with this idea of pendulum politics, which is completely unoriginal. And it's essentially the idea that people get fed up of governments over time and switch their allegiance to the opposition, and then things go backwards and forwards. And it's what political scientists have been talking about for decades in different ways. But I thought it might be interesting to look at how that has happened in Chile, starting from, to be ultra precise, something like the 18th of October of 2019, when all of a sudden it seemed that Chile had exploded. In fact, in Spanish, they call it the estallido social, the social explosion, which was this massive wave of protest, violence, disruption, looting that really dominated Chile between, let's say, October 2019 and March 2020. That was 6 terrible months, which left something like 34 people dead, billions worth of property losses, and a very bad sort of situation as far as human rights were concerned. There were lots of people who'd been injured lost their sight, in fact, by tear gas being fired directly at protesters. So if you like, that is the most violent point in the Chile cycle. And I started looking at how it then evolved.
And where can we? I mean, you say this in this sort of pendulum politics. Of course, that's a very visual, very visual way of explaining the things. But this is something that has been simmering for some time, I think, in Chile. And I think could we be able to relate this to a certain search for identity in a post-Pinochet Chile? Because I think this is a man that we cannot fail to mention on a podcast or in any conversation about Chile.
Yes. I mean, one way of putting it is that after Pinochet's 17 years in power, which went up to 1990, Chile had apparently progressed very well. It kept some of the market-friendly, market-focused economic policies, but under a series, first of moderate left-wing governments and then an alternation between left and right, there was a lot of social reform, and it seemed as if Chile had become a stable, rules-led, functioning, strong democracy, which people were happy with, or which analysts like me assumed people were happy with. And if you looked at Chile in terms of GDP per capita, various measurements of economic growth, it was sort of almost top of the class in Latin America. So the social explosion caught, again, lots of pundits like myself, completely off guard. It was unexpected. Looking back on it, there are a series of quite logical explanations. So to give you an example, pension reform, the introduction of privatized pension systems in Chile, which goes back to the Pinochet era, was welcomed as a great success by people who were looking at how the pension funds were creating capital markets and providing a channel for investment. So that seemed to be a success story. But if you look at it from a different angle, the fact that the pensions actually being paid out were not enough to live off, you have this basically crisis. People are very, very aware of the harsh inequalities of the Chilean sort of ideal economy. And that was one of the factors. You look at other things, there's a big privatization of university level education. A lot of students gained access to university education by incurring very, very large debt, very large loans. And then they find out when graduation time came, it was really hard to get a job. So there was this basically simmering pot of discontent and anger that despite all the talk of the Chilean economic miracle, life was extremely hard. And that, if you like, was one of the triggers for the social explosion.
So it seems to me, I mean, we look at Latin America, this inequality, economic hardship seems to be a regional issue. But as you say, I find this very interesting when we look at the Chilean miracle. That was largely more when I'd like to take that really when we think of extractive industries and then of course stability, but of course it was not converting into economic wealth to the needy on the ground.
Correct. And there's also a decentralization angle to it, in that a lot of the mining, as you know, occurs in the north of Chile. And a lot of the money from royalties and mining taxes somehow seems to go to Santiago and not come back to the local communities. So there was a level of disenchantment and anger over that as well.
Okay, so that let's say that brings us up to 2019 and the estallido social, the image of the protesters around there's the monument and the flags coming up, that every front page, Chile got the front page for the first time, I think, since Tony Blair era and Pinochet in under house arrest due to Jack Straw there in England, and we get this figure who I suppose is a student leader, Gabriel Boric.
Yes.
And I mean, I am not a Chile analyst, you are, but was he known to you before this estallido social?
No. I first found out about him during the estallido social when he appears as a student leader, and he's leading. I suppose one way of looking at it is saying that in Chile, one of the interesting things that's happened is that there have been divisions on both the left and the right. And on the left, there was what you might call the old left, which had been apparently very successful. It's those moderate left-wing governments I was talking about throughout the 1990s and the noughties. But there was also a new, more radical left, which had slightly different concerns. It had the same concern for redistribution of income that social democrats have always had, but it was much, much more aware of identity politics, of indigenous claims to their ancestral lands, and all sorts of things like that, particularly on the environment. So it was a new politics. There was a generational gap. You have the old left leaders who are in their 60s and 70s, a lot of them, and you have Boric, who is, I think, now 37. He's a millennial, much younger, idealistic sort of approach. And he, out of the estallido social, this new left emerges with greater appeal and strength, and it seems as if that pendulum is still heading left. You have general elections in November 2021, and what you get there is the emergence of the new right. The old right was slightly patrician, the traditional establishment. The new right is much more Trump-like, under José Antonio Cast, who actually wins the first ballot of the 2021 elections, and Boric comes second. On the second ballot, Boric wins with a clear majority. So it looks as if society's heading left. The other major element in this is an agreement to reform and write a new constitution, because all this time Chile has been working on the 1980 constitution, which was written and introduced under military rule. So even though over the years it's been reformed in many ways, it's still seen with a degree of resentment by the left. This is Pinochet's constitution that's still ruling us. And it contains this idea, which the left rejects, which is that it is always it should be left to the private sector to resolve any problem. It's the primary approach to managing activity in Chile. And if the private sector can't do it, then it's okay for the state to do it. But the private sector gets the first bite of the apple, which people call el Estado subsidiario, the subsidiary state. And there is this intense opposition to it. And this leads to a constitutional reform process, which is very elaborate and very complicated, which starts in 2022 mainly, and is, I think, a key turning point, if we're still thinking about the pendulum. The constitutional process which Boric hopes, Boric's hope is that he's got a 4-year term in office. First year, change the constitution. Years 2, 3, and 4, deliver what was promised in that constitutional change. And the project is basically, one version of it is to make Chile look a bit more like Denmark, to increase public spending, to have a more inclusive social welfare state. And that will, if you put that into the constitution, then as a government, you start implementing it, you start putting more public sector money to buoy up the state pension system, you invest in education and various reforms. And the problem that hits Boric is that in his first year, he fails to get the constitutional reform through. And the failure of the constitutional reform, I think, is very interesting, because in many ways it looks as if the left overreaches. So what you've got is an elected, in effect, an elected constituent assembly, which the right is underrepresented in, partly because the electorate didn't choose them, but also partly because the left and independents and pro-indigenous community groups and NGOs campaign much more effectively. They get control of the Constituent Assembly, but they come up with a draft constitution which for many people appears to be way too idealistic and impractical. And you start getting public opinion beginning to shift from being all in favor of constitutional reform. It becomes, public opinion starts saying, well, we're in favor of constitutional reform, but we don't agree with some of the details. And there begins to be this sort of separation of ways, if you like. The Constituent Assembly contributes to this up to a certain point, because it, for example, it proposes a wide-ranging recognition of indigenous rights to their ancestral lands, and promises to give the land back or to compensate economically for the loss of land. And this is where it starts getting really complicated, because it turns out that in the 19th century, successive Chilean governments encouraged immigration and brought in settlers and gave them land and title to land which overlaps on indigenous people's land. So how you are going to resolve this gets quite complicated. And a lot of people think that the Constituent Assembly, which talks about a plurinational state, where you almost have parallel organizations for Mapuche Indians, for the different different indigenous groups is too divisive,
Mm.
and it's unsustainable. And in a lot of other areas, there are also queries about the viability of the reforms. There's an attempt to weaken the role of the Senate, which the right doesn't like, and the whole process gets slow, complicated, and increasingly unpopular. So during the course of 2022, you start seeing the opinion polls beginning to move in a more rightward direction. And I think April last year, the opinion polls were saying, when the new constitution goes to referendum, there is a chance that it won't be approved. And that gathers pace, and is not helped by the government appearing quite idealistic but inexperienced in the way it tries to solve a number of other problems. And so what you get finally is in September last year, it goes as expected to a referendum, and it's rejected by a very significant majority. I think it was 62% rejected the new constitution. So what you then have is that Boric has to kind of start again. So 2022 major attempt to reform constitution, it failed. 2023, this year, there is a new major attempt, a plan B, to reform the constitution, with a lot more safeguards to try and prevent it being too radical or idealistic. And that process is now running.
And what do we think? I mean, and you as an expert, what do we think is going to happen? I realize we're early in. When will it go to referendum, first and foremost?
It'll go to referendum. I think the exact date is something like the 17th of December.
Okay.
And one of the key points is happening now in a couple of weeks, 7th of May. This time, previously there was a 155 seat constituent convention, it was called. Now there will be a 50 seat constitutional council, which has the job of proposing a new constitution. But Boric and the political parties he's worked with have put in all sorts of safeguards. So there is something like 12 constitutional principles agreed by all parties, which, for example, say there is a single unitary state. You don't have, autonomous, indigenous parallel states, and there will be a Senate. It's kind of limited what the radicalism of a new constitution. There's a committee of 24 constitutional experts chosen by Congress, which in effect has already written the new constitution. It goes to this 50-strong council, which will make modifications, and ultimately it gets submitted to a new referendum, as I said, that'll happen in December. So Boric's hope is that he wanted to start proper social reforms in year 2. Now it's going to look like year 3 that he's going to get round to that. His position still remains pretty difficult because of this swing to the right. So to give you an example, earlier in March, his plans for a major tax reform, which would fund these social programs and changes, sort of blew up in his face because it failed to get through Congress, where he didn't have a majority, but it was thought that he could pull a majority together for that issue. It represents something like 3.4% of GDP in additional revenues, and it was thrown out. And under Chilean regulations, when a tax bill of that kind gets defeated, you can't present it again until after a year. So at the moment, Boric's budget plans are looking very uncertain. It's likely that what the government will try and do is raise other taxes that weren't in its first proposal. It may go back and look at trying to get more out of a mining royalty, which the mining industry doesn't like, obviously. But he will have to try and find money to fund the planned reforms, which will come later than expected.
Well, so he's in a very, very difficult situation. I mean, first, the constitutional reform, the referendum going against him, this tax reform not getting through Congress, having to wait till December for the next sort of referendum on constitutional reform. But then, of course, as you say, tax reform will need to be in 2024, I suppose, as we're looking at. And this pendulum, as you say, it seems to be very much with the right in ascendance still. I think how much, as you say, that caste is of the new right, a very Trumpist right. How much of their activity do you feel is just, well, just to impede Boric rather than actually have a political mandate themselves?
I think we need to introduce another factor into explaining this, and that factor is crime and security.
Yes.
Which has become the hottest topic in Chile at the moment, and if you like, the vehicle for the right to flex its muscles. So very, very briefly, because it's a complicated story, there are growing crime rates in Chile. There's argument over the exact statistic, but what you have is a significant number of refugees or migrants entering the country from the northern borders, largely through Bolivia. And these are often Venezuelans, some Colombians, Haitians, and people who've, rather than go north to the United States, they're going south to Chile because Chile has got a significantly high living standard compared to where they're coming from. Some of those people are being managed into Chile by people traffickers, and that is being used to spread a rising crime rate, or one of its effects is to spread a rising crime rate into the country. So to give you an example, there's a Venezuelan crime syndicate called the Tren de Aragua.
Oh, yes.
And a lot of people have been trafficked into Chile, so they pay various $1,000s to somebody from the Tren de Aragua who helps them cross into Chile. Once into Chile, the contact with the people smuggler guy is prolonged, and they start saying, "Oh, and you also owe me this, repay this debt," and they start running an extortion business. And one of the things that crime syndicates in Latin America are very good at is diversifying. So they moved from people trafficking into drug trafficking, into extortion, into various things like that. And local criminal groups are kind of following their lead and diversifying. So there is, without doubt, there is a crime problem. The homicide rate last year increased by something like 40% to over 800 homicides. To put this in context, it's still very low compared to Colombia or Mexico. The homicides per 100,000 inhabitants in Chile are between 4 and 5, whereas I think in Colombia it's about 20, something like that, and in Venezuela it's even higher.
Yes.
So the problem, the law and order issue, is something that Chileans feel very threatened by, and the right is capitalizing on that. Now, it's not just caste who's capitalizing on it. It's part of the old right, which is, if you like, re-energizing itself, and in particular the Unión Democrática Independiente, UDI, which is a long-standing right-wing party created during the Pinochet era. It's kind of come to the forefront, and it has, in effect, forced the Boric government to approve a whole new set of decrees and regulations. One of the most important ones being the concept that there's a law called the Ley Naim Retamal, which is named after 2 carabineros, military police, who were shot dead by criminals. So it's quite an emotive way of positioning it. And one of the things it does is introduce the concept of legitimate privileged defense, which basically says that in a violent encounter, the carabinero or police official involved is protected under law. And this replaces the previous concept, was that all actions by the police have to be proportional to the threat perceived. So it shifts things a little bit in favor of the police and gives them a degree of impunity when it comes to it in armed encounters. The left, this has caused a split in Boric's coalition. The left and human rights groups are very worried, and they have called it the trigger happy law, because it means that, police are likely to shoot first and ask questions later. Interestingly, the most popular politician in the country at the moment is Evelyn Matei, who is a member of UDI and the daughter of an Air Force general, in fact, a daughter of the commander of the Air Force during the Pinochet era. She's previously been a presidential candidate. She's now a mayor of one of the municipalities in Santiago. And she has basically been leading this charge to the right, along with another UDI member who's come up with the idea of bulldozing houses that have been used, they're so-called narco casas, which are houses where settlers, squatters have got in and turned them into crack dens or, drug distribution centers. So what he's doing is he's literally getting bulldozers and flattening those houses, which has gained him a lot of popularity. And at the moment, it looks as if Boric is he's lost the political initiative and is having to make concessions to the right to try and keep his key projects on the go.
That I can just imagine that the bulldozing, we all love something so visual, and of course it seems like an immediate solution to a very emotive problem, that of security and of course migration and crime. But how much of this, crime in Chile has always been, at least in my lifetime, having been to Chile on various occasions, it's always been seen as the safest, or if not the safest, alongside like Uruguay, or for example. Are people, can people say that they're overreacting on this? If we put it into context with neighbors, I don't like to put it like that, because Chile has lived, have worked into a privileged situation, exports, incomes, and of course, a very low security issue. But when we put it into the whole sort of, into a regional league table, it's still soaring ahead. Yeah,
it's interesting because I think there are two important comparisons. One is, how is Chile doing relative to the rest of Latin America?
Yes.
And the answer to that is it's doing really well still. But then the second question you have to ask is, how is Chile doing compared to how it was doing 10 years ago or 5 years ago? And the answer to that is that crime has increased.
Yes.
And although there are arguments about the exact statistics, I think the average Chilean citizen is correct to be worried about crime. And you can also understand that from his or her position, what's happening in Colombia or Brazil is of no interest. They compare with what it was like last year. So that remains an issue. And it is also, the difficulty is that most experts on crime usually come up with the idea that reducing the crime rate, there is no silver bullet, there is no magical thing you can do. There is a combination of different factors. Human rights need to be protected in the process. You need a police that has the resources and the power to investigate. You need good forensic services. You need all that. And that doesn't make such a sexy political slogan. So it would appear, some members of the right, of right-wing political parties may have a much more sophisticated analysis, but a lot of them are coming up with, if you like, slogans which are popular, but which may not actually reduce the crime rate. And this, I think, is something that happens all around Latin America. People do tend to like la mano dura, even if there is not necessarily the evidence to show that it is working and actually reducing crime.
So it does seem that so much is he's up against the wall, Boric. Yeah. He really does have his back up against the wall. Is there any way that he can claw back support and try and somehow get through this constitutional reform later on in the year, or are we looking at already, a lame duck within his term?
I don't think he's a lame duck yet. He's basically just gone past the first anniversary. So he took office March 21. March. He's been in office for a year, basically. One more positive thing from his point of view is that if you look at the approval ratings of previous presidents, he's not necessarily doing that bad. Mm-hmm. So in other words, I think he currently has an approval rating of about 35% and a disapproval rating of 60%. So that, the survey people say that's a net minus 25% approval rate. But it turns out that one of his predecessors, the old left heroine, if you like, Michelle Bachelet, who was president twice, at the same time in her first presidency, she was about the same, in the same place as Boric is now. And she then improved. So not all governments start popular and end up hatred. Some have ups and downs in between. And he did, for example, around about last November, he finally announced the shape of the pension reform, which was a sort of moderate reform. The private sector will have a slightly different role, but it will still be present. Contributions to pension funds will go up from 10% of salary to 16% of salary. There will be an attempt to create minimum pensions for everyone. When that was announced, his approval rating jumped by 5 or 6 points or something like that. So it is still possible that if he can find his way through this jigsaw puzzle of responding to the right-wing demands on security, while at the same time finding a way to raise taxes that gets round, the defeat of his tax proposal in Congress. It is possible that he might be able to deliver some of the other reforms of different types, social programs of different types, and that will give him, if you like, some midterm oxygen and help him to move forward. One thing that has been part of this whole thing is that he is becoming increasingly reliant, not on his old new left, but on the old left. So, for example, his current interior minister, Carolina Toja, she's an old left sort of colleague of Bachelet going back some years, and this is sort of well, it depends what adjectives you want to choose, but you could say they're all older, or you could say they're all more mature and politically experienced, and have a better way of handling political negotiations than the new left, which tended to think, we just say what we want and it gets imposed quickly, and the old left knows it's not that. It's got to do give and take.
The reaction to knee-jerk politics of the new left, and sort of, let's say, more moderate negotiations and agreements behind closed doors that get the things through. We have to finish up quite soon, but let's talk about Boric's big problem number one, the Mapuche militants.
Yes.
And I guess this comes into land control and what belongs to whom.
Yes. So what you have particularly in this area called La Araucanía, It's also known as the Macrozona Sur. You have a large Mapuche population. They don't just live there, they live throughout all of Chile, but there's quite a strong concentration there. And some of their ancestral lands have been taken over the years by logging company, by farming companies, by incoming settlers, and this has led to a degree of ongoing resentment. A very small proportion of the Mapuche community, because it is small, are extremely militant and are running what you might call as an armed insurrection throughout that area. And what happens is they will attack sawmills run by logging companies, burn them down. They will burn houses belonging to people who've come in from other areas of the country, and they have been clashing with the security forces. And the Boric government's approach was initially incredibly idealistic. They said we're gonna lift the state of emergency because military repression is not the way to deal with this problem, and we're just going to negotiate. And there was an infamous incident just after Boric had been sworn in, when his new interior minister just went to the Araucanía, sort of like, I'm here, talk to me. And as she entered in a particular sort of comuna, a particular district, gunfire broke out. And it was clear that this was essentially a conflict zone, and her security staff had to pull her out of there. And this has become, it's sort of, it's indicative of this idea that there was a simple solution. And of course, it turned out that there wasn't a simple solution. Boric came under increasing pressure to reinstate the state of emergency, which he ended up doing, and now it gets renovated every 30 days or so. So that remains in place. And despite the new government's efforts, no significant negotiations have commenced. And it turns out that some of the radical Mapuche groups, I'm almost tempted to say, are not really that interested in negotiating, because you'd think there might be a deal to be done about relative autonomy in particular parts of the country, but it seems what the more radical Mapuche groups really want is complete independence. They want to break away from Chile, which is a major issue. It also turns out, and I think from your knowledge of Colombia, this will sound a familiar theme, that some of these radical groups have links to the illicit economy. So theft of logging, various, if you like, operations of that kind, give them a resilience and an unwillingness to negotiate that is difficult to deal with for the Boric government, or indeed for any other Boric government. So it doesn't look as if there's an early solution to problem number one, but you have to find some way of managing it. And Boric's issue is that he's under pressure in the south over the Mapuche issue, and he's under pressure in the north over migration and crime. So it is a very difficult issue to deal with.
It just sounds like there's so many complex issues, as you say, to deal with. I think, he needs a quick win, doesn't he, to gain back this political initiative. As you said, it was a political oxygen, a midterm dose of political oxygen for his party. But it seems to me an underlying fact is that people want to believe in change, but not extreme change. Just, little by little, let's move towards, I don't know, a Danish model, but not, we don't want to do it all at once. It needs to be a process. Would you say that's correct?
I'd say that is correct. And that there's an interesting comparison with Colombia, where Gustavo Petro is searching for, total peace. It's almost like he's tackling all the problems at once. everywhere all of a sudden, or whatever the film is called. He wants to do it all very quickly.
Yeah.
And I think Boric's experience in Chile is that there has to be some form of priorities,
Yes.
fixing one problem at a time, because otherwise you come under siege. You're trying to, you don't have the bandwidth to tackle everything that needs to be tackled at once. So you need to find some way where some of the problems you put them on hold and you say, well, I'll get back to that when I've solved, can't get to Y until I solve X.
That sounds incredibly reasonable and very apt in terms of Colombia, Chile, and the comparison. Of course, they're great friends, Boric and Petro. But at the same time, let's bring this to an end, because we've covered so much, and I'd just like to say thank you for your time. As we've been talking to Andrew Thompson, freelance journalist, expert on Chile, giving us unrivaled and unselfish knowledge into Chile and a lot of the issues and problems facing Gabriel Boric, the current president at this moment in time. Can he find a way to claw back an initiative and some sort of support and power? Well, the question remains, doesn't it, Andrew, I think? And well, that's us signing off for episode 2 of the Latin News Podcast. This is a new fortnightly episode from LatinNews.com. Be sure to check out episode 1, that was 2 weeks ago, where we discussed Peru's ongoing political crisis with the editor-in-chief of Latin News, John Farmer. We'll be going on in 2 weeks' time to discuss Lula in Brazil. What more than Lula in Brazil? But let me say thank you again to Andrew Thompson. I've been your host, Richard McCall, for the Latin News Podcast. Thank you. Please subscribe, tune in, and share the show all around. Bye-bye.